The Ottoman Empire is often remembered for how far it reached. Its borders once pressed against 3 continents. Its armies crossed seas, mountains, and deserts. Its rulers imagined a state without edges. But there was a moment when expansion was no longer the question. Not because the empire was weak, not because its enemies had won, but because the center itself hesitated. Empires rarely announce when they turn inward. There is no ceremony for retreat of the imagination. From the outside, the empire still looks immense. From within, something has already shifted. This episode examines that shift. Not a single battle or treaty, but a decision, gradual, contested, and incomplete, that altered how the Ottoman state understood itself. A decision that did not end the empire, but quietly changed its direction. The Ottoman Empire did not begin as a defensive power. It grew by movement, by absorption, by crossing frontiers before they hardened into borders. For centuries, the Ottomans expanded not only through conquest, but through integration. New lands were folded into existing systems. Local elites were absorbed rather than erased. Difference was managed, not eliminated. This outward motion shaped how authority worked. The state was designed to rule diversity. Its legitimacy came from reach, the ability to govern far from the center without constant force. But by the late 17th century, something began to strain. The empire had not stopped winning entirely, but victories were harder, slower, more costly. Defeats, when they came, lingered longer in memory. The Battle of Vienna in 1683 is often treated as a symbolic turning point, the moment when Ottoman expansion into Europe finally failed. But symbols simplify. What mattered more was not the loss itself, but the response to it. After Vienna, the Ottomans faced a choice that empires always face sooner or later. Whether setbacks are temporary interruptions, or signs that the logic of expansion itself must change. For a time, the empire attempted correction without transformation. More armies, more reforms, more effort applied to familiar methods. But the world around the Ottomans was changing in ways that were difficult to absorb. European states were centralizing power differently. Military organization was shifting. Fiscal systems were becoming more extractive, more precise. The Ottomans were not unaware of this. They observed closely. They sent envoys. They gathered reports. But observation is not the same as adoption. Internally, the empire was structured around balance, between the sultan and the bureaucracy, between the center and the provinces, between military elites, religious authorities, and administrators. This balance had once been a strength. It prevented any single faction from overwhelming the system. It allowed flexibility across vast distances. But balance can also slow response, especially when external pressure accelerates. By the early 18th century, the empire was no longer primarily asking how far it could expand. It was asking how much it could hold together. Territory that had once been an opportunity now appeared as a liability. Distant provinces demanded resources without guaranteeing stability. Local power holders became harder to control from the center. The logic of governance began to change. Instead of projecting authority outward, the state increasingly focused on consolidation, securing revenue, stabilizing administration, reasserting control over what it already possessed. This was not announced as retreat. It was framed as preservation. But preservation carries its own assumptions. It implies that what exists is worth freezing. That stability is preferable to risk, that the future should resemble the present more than the past. This inward turn was not purely geographic, it was psychological. The empire's leadership began to see uncertainty not as a field for expansion, but as a threat to be managed. Difference, once tolerated as a feature of imperial rule, became harder to justify. Uniformity promised control. One of the clearest signs of this shift appeared in the provinces. Earlier, Ottoman governance relied heavily on negotiated authority. Local customs were maintained, Religious communities governed their own affairs. Taxation was flexible, adaptive. Over time, this looseness came to be seen as inefficiency, as weakness. The state began to standardize, to categorize, to record. What had once been relational authority became administrative authority. This change brought order, but also distance. Subjects increasingly encountered the empire not as a mediator, but as an extractor, not as a protector of diversity, but as a manager of populations. The inward turn also reshaped the role of the sultan. Earlier sultans were warrior rulers. They led campaigns. Their legitimacy was tied to movement and conquest. Later sultans ruled more from within the palace. Authority became ceremonial, symbolic, ritualized. Power did not disappear, it changed form. Decisions were made through layers of bureaucracy. Responsibility diffused. Failure became harder to locate, and therefore harder to correct. The empire was not collapsing, it was thickening. Institutions multiplied, rules accumulated, exceptions narrowed. This inward focus intensified during the 19th century, especially under the pressure of European influence. Reforms were introduced, the Tanzimat, promising modernization, equality before the law, centralized administration. On the surface, these reforms looked outward, inspired by European models, but their purpose was deeply inward. They were attempts to save the empire by reorganizing its core, to create a state that could survive without expanding, to preserve authority by redefining it. In doing so, the empire increasingly understood itself as a bounded entity, not a fluid, expanding order, but a fixed state among other states. This was a profound conceptual shift. An empire thinks in terms of margins, a state thinks in terms of borders. Once borders become primary, anxiety follows. What lies beyond them is no longer potential, it is threat. The Ottoman inward turn sharpened this anxiety. Nationalist movements within the empire were no longer seen as manageable differences, but existential dangers. Control tightened, surveillance increased, suspicion hardened, authority became defensive, and defensive authority behaves differently. It reacts more than it initiates. It prioritizes cohesion over creativity. It fears fracture more than stagnation. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was still vast, but no longer expansive in spirit. Its decisions were shaped by what might be lost rather than what might be gained. When the empire finally collapsed after the First World War, it did not feel like a sudden end. It felt like the final consequence of a long inward gaze. But collapse is not the most revealing outcome. What matters is how long the empire existed in this inward state, how many decades it spent managing decline without admitting it, how authority can persist even as confidence erodes. The Ottoman case raises a quieter question about power itself, whether authority depends more on movement or control, whether systems built for expansion can adapt to preservation, whether turning inward is a choice or an inevitability. Empires often imagine that survival means holding what they have, but holding requires a different kind of legitimacy than expanding. Expansion tolerates ambiguity. Preservation demands certainty. The Ottoman Empire struggled with this transition not because it lacked intelligence or awareness, but because its foundational logic resisted the change. It was an empire built to rule difference, not to define identity. Built to manage vastness, not to police borders. When it turned inward, it gained control, but lost elasticity. It gained administration, but lost imagination. The fracture comes here. If authority shifts inward when it fears loss, what does that suggest about our own responses to uncertainty? When systems, or individuals, stop expanding their sense of possibility, what do they replace it with? The Ottoman Empire did not disappear the moment it turned inward. It lasted for generations after that decision took shape. which suggests that inward turns can be stable, even comfortable, for a time. But stability is not the same as vitality, and preservation is not the same as purpose. The empire's long inward gaze left behind institutions, borders, and memories that still shape the present. Not because they resolved anything, but because they didn't. The question lingers not in how the Ottomans fell, but in how long they endured while quietly redefining what authority meant. Perhaps the most enduring pattern is this: power rarely vanishes. It contracts, it consolidates, it learns to live within narrower horizons. And in that narrowing, something essential is often lost. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, as the future becomes something to defend against rather than move toward. If this story gave you something to think about, consider subscribing to Timeless Questions. We explore history, philosophy, and the patterns that quietly guide human behavior.